they? Can you go and grab them, please? Right, well, welcome gentlemen. Well, this is our last item for the day, and Dr. Pearce, I probably owe you an explanation and an apology. Should have encouraged you to be a bit earlier today, but that was my fault, not yours. So never mind, you're here now, and good to see you, and the floor is yours. Microphone, please.
And is there an apple for the teacher? We'll see. I had it at lunch, all right. So we've got a brief update for you in open session, Chairman. There are things that we would like to talk to you about in more detail in a confidential framework, and how we might achieve that, I think, is over to you in terms of the process. But we would welcome the opportunity, as was undertaken in the previous meeting where Jim was attending in my place, to have a more open but confidential discussion. We'll give you, first of all, our regrets that we weren't able to give you a formal written report, a combination of timing of our meetings and yours and your deadline for getting papers out. So our last meeting was on the morning of the same day that you have a 1 p.m. deadline for papers to get out, so that's why there wasn't a written report. We'll give you an update on water uptake, and Andrew will speak to that. But the headline essentially is steady progress since the quite full update that you got at the last meeting. We are making good progress on the design and construction contract and with investors, although both of those are going somewhat slower than we hoped. Probably the key message around that I can say in public, but happy to give you more detail again in confidence later. We are having to consider a larger and wider secondary distribution network to reflect both the demand and the spread of that demand over a bigger footprint of the whole irrigation scheme, and that means that we're having to work quite hard to optimise the secondary distribution, not the primary distribution, which is the head race canal and the major pipes, but to optimise the scale and location of the secondary distribution to reflect the spread of that demand. Again, we're happy to talk to you about that in more detail and the implications that has. And again, in the confidential session, I'd like to give you an update on Napier Port director appointments. And again, we have a timing issue there that I want to talk to you about, but clearly that reflects or affects individual people, so I prefer to do that on a confidential basis. So Andrew, I'll hand over to you to do an update on the uptake.
Yeah, thanks Chairman. So I've just circulated the table that you saw last time. Rather than going through that in huge amounts of detail, I'll just give you a bit of a flavour as to what's moved since we last talked to you. So we've got about 3.5 million in countersigned. It's moved. So how I describe progress in that area is that sort of on a daily basis we have another 1 or 2 contracts to dribble in. I do expect that to gather a wee bit of pace in the next couple of weeks. But the trajectory is going to, generally speaking, going the right way. Stage 3 to 6, so that's out of 1 and 2, which is the balance of the pipeline that's been in due diligence. we're just under 3 mil there. And if you convert that to, if you sort of took that and then forecast through over the next month to 6 weeks, then we expect to be north of 40 in stages 3 to 6, and will certainly be well advanced in terms of countersigned contracts. So I'm, based on this current and what I call local demand, I do expect that we will be at a point where we reach 45 million cubic metres of water. Just in terms of numbers of transactions, just there I note that we've moved 18 more transactions through into that overall 3 to 6 pipeline. And interestingly, just a wee bit of sentiment down in the footprint. We are starting to see, they tend to be small transactions, but we're seeing some parties who decided that they weren't progressing have changed their mind and are. And that's a bit of a change in sentiment. And finally, there, the 11th of November does remain a critical date for the HBRIC board to have a pretty serious look at its uptake forecast and satisfy itself that it's got sufficient demand to continue onwards. And that date still remains with that sort of emphasis. Okay.
So if we look at the average rate of increase over the 4 weeks since we last reported to you, it's about 750,000 cubic metres of water in the 3 to 6 pipeline per week. So in another couple of weeks to the 11th of November, we're thinking that we'll move from the current 37.9 million cubic metres to just under 40. The rate may well increase, and by the end of November we could well be 41 million or a number in that sort of order. Clearly we are going to look pretty hard at this on the 11th, which is the date that we've said we'll assess whether or not we have enough probable demand to continue. Happy to take questions on uptake.
Question. Councillor Barker.
First question, I'd like you to describe to me the significance of the 11th of November apart from the date. But I got the impression from our last presentation the 11th of November was going to be go, no go. Yet in the presentation that Andrew gave, he talked about over the next couple of months. Well, the 11th of November is not another couple of months away. So when is the 11th of November go, no go, or is it sometime after that?
So I think I've just said that on the 11th of November we'll consider whether or not we have enough interest to justify progressing. That's probably, it's not a hard line. We will form a view then whether we have enough interest. If we're at 41 million cubic metres, we will probably form a view that we have enough interest.
Second question, if I may.
Well, anything to add to that?
No, it is an important milestone. It's been an important date out there in the farming community, and it's basically always been a case we need sufficient interest from the customer base to justify this, and that's exactly what it is. But I would also note that in an ideal world, if everything had gone absolutely perfectly, we'd be sitting here saying that's a hard deadline, but we have slippage in other parts of the deal. So construction timing, that sort of stuff, which we did talk about in the September meeting actually.
So just a follow-up question to that. So if the 11th is now no longer a critical decision time, and you're not going to come to us on or after the 11th with a recommendation, but you decide at that point that it's worth proceeding with, what is the new deadline you're going to set yourselves?
I think we'd prefer to talk to you about that in a more rounded way when we give you an update on the design and construction and on investors.
There was another question.
There was another question.
Councillor Barker.
I've got a couple of, but I'll just ask this question and I'll leave it to others. Are you getting from the existing people an indication that they are wishing to increase the amount of area they wish to irrigate, and therefore increasing their uptake. It seems to me at the moment your presentation is about just new sign-ups, but I would have thought maybe some of the people have decided that they will take more water and increase their area of irrigation. Is there a bit of that going on?
Oh, there's a wee bit of that going on, initiated by those parties, not us. But I mean, there's no great surprise in this. As and when we start to really reach a pointy end of this transaction, there will be a discussion with parties that are sitting in that pipeline, certainly countersigned as to whether whether they're interested in taking more water and what benefit there is both ways in that, actually, because the fundamental issue is the higher the uptake number, the better the cash flows, the less risk for every party in the transaction, including the farmer base. So that conversation is coming, but it's a question of when we do it, and in our views we'll do that right towards the back end. And I'd just add to that, we'd far rather do that when we've got a preferred investor sitting in the room with us, and also having nailed down the D&C piece. But it's coming.
Chairman, if I could say one thing in relation to Councillor Bevan's question. The one thing I am comfortable about saying in public is that obviously Forest and Bird have filed a judicial review on the DOC land exchange decision. Excuse me, we don't know what the timeline for that is, but we are filing for urgency on that this week. And Forest and Bird have indicated that they won't resist urgency, but it's not completely within our hands as to what the timeline will be for either setting a court date or appointing a judge.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This piece of paper sort of suggests that an adjustment since 30 September is that you added 3.56 million cubic meters countersign. Isn't it more accurate to say that you've added 3.56 in the last 90 days? Since that was the number, 20.1 or so was the number given back in July. So it's taken 3 months to sell an additional 3.5 million cubic meters. Where does the optimism come from about accelerating this process between now and November 11th?
Councillor Belford, if you've dealt with a few farmers over a period of time, you'll probably understand that deadlines, and that many of them are deadline driven, actually. So when I say it's optimism, it's not optimism, it's based on substance. So we have these transactions, as you know, because we discussed it last time, down to classification right across the entire pipeline as to whether they're in the business, they're not in the business, they may be in the business. And so I have a team of four people who are experienced, both farmers and also rural bankers who have spent a significant amount of their career in this type of business, who are giving this advice in discussions with farmers directly. So it's not optimism, it's based on a hell of a lot of information and pretty solid information.
I'll add one more thing, if I may, Chairman. So the number that I gave to you, which is 750,000, $750,000 per week over the last 4 weeks, is the number that's in the 3 to 6, 2.7 million, divided by 4. It's fairly simple arithmetic. I did not speak, contrary to your claim, Councillor Belford, about an acceleration between now and the 11th of December. I said if that trend continues at 750,000 a week till the 11th of November, we will get to slightly short of 40 million. Please don't take our words and correct them.
Questions?
General matter. There was in the interest of transparency and getting correct information out there, there was an item in the paper recently that made a claim that on top of the 300 million required to build the dam, there was 300 million investment required on farm. Is there anything that you're aware of? I thought I was aware of most reports that actually says that that is the level of investment that is needed in order to make this work.
There's, if you were to go back to the McFarlane Rural Business on-farm feasibility assessment, there's a substantial on-farm investment, capital investment over and above the off-farm investment. So the off-farm investment being the dam and pipelines and distribution infrastructure. And that number will vary depending, quite considerably actually, depending on the farming system type. So for example, I can't give you an accurate figure today, but it's the most expensive conversion type is a dryland farm to dairy, where you've got a dairy shed, you've got all that goes with that, all that infrastructure, whereas a dryland farm converting to an arable system is a substantially different issue. So the capital number is significant on farm, and it could be north of $200 million, but ultimately the actual number will depend on the farming system type. And the other point I'd make about that is that capital investment will take place over a period of years through the uptake curve. So it could be a 14-year period from today over which that capital investment takes place. But the final point I would make is that that's all inwards investment into this region. So it seems to be a good thing.
You good, Jim? Right. Any other questions? Councillor Barker.
I've got one, it's about the forest and bird. I've asked, as you recall, lots of questions about this over a period of time. It's always seemed to me the land swap was going to be a very tricky issue. And I'd like for you to describe to me how HBRIC has managed this issue over the period of time in terms of its relationship with forest and bird. Because it seemed to always to me to be loom as the biggest, one of the biggest problems to get around.
Would you like to repeat the question for me so I know what the question is?
I would like you to describe for me how HBRIC has managed its relationship with forest and bird in using its best endeavours to avoid the litigation which is currently now before the court. It seems to me this is a relationship issue, and for my part I always saw the land swap as being one of the vulnerabilities to this project. So how has HBRIC managed its relationship with forest and bird in order to try and avoid any potential litigation which has now become a reality?
Forest and Bird have made it clear from the outset that they were going to challenge this land exchange. We have had various exchanges with them, both in public and in private, but they have been very consistent in saying that they were going to challenge this, and they have done. And that is no surprise either to you or me, I suspect. And my personal view is that nothing that we could have done would have changed that. And in fact, it is a challenge to DOC's decision-making process. We are named as the second respondent, or whatever the correct term is, but I say again, I don't believe that there's anything that we could have done that would have changed the situation. I'm sorry, but I believe it does.
Yeah, maybe a broader period of time. So if you were to go back a number of years to the feasibility study phase, and Councillor Belford will remember this because he was on the group, the Ruatana Board was the liaison group. I can't remember quite the label of it, but that was a 2.5-year process, and in that process Forest and Bird were fully engaged through that entire journey, including, from my recollection, largely agreeing the biodiversity offsets program, actually, through that phase. Now what happened then was clearly the process went into a RMA EPA Board of Inquiry process, and not unusually, because this happens across all these processes invariably, various parties maintain a different position than they might have started with in the collaborative phase, actually, and that's what happened here. Now, it's no secret that we've talked to, or my team's talked to forest and bird people locally about this issue, and I think for some, anyway, there's an understanding there's some broader benefits to be achieved through the scheme, but without casting any particular view on it, that's not always a common view necessarily across Forest and Bird itself, let alone any other party. So, and they've chosen to say publicly they want to test the law around these types of transactions with DOC from a national objectives point of view. So the Rural TANF is just part of the, is hooked up in that process.
Any further questions? Sorry, Councillor Hewitt, I missed you there before, sorry.
I'll just carry on the Forest and Bird theme as well. And you're right, Forest and Bird, we're part of the stakeholder group all the way through. And of note, they substituted their people right at the end of the stakeholder process. So they were collaboratively engaged, and and a few agendas changed towards the end. And I can recall quite clearly that one of the Forest and Bird representatives voted against something in the biodiversity discussions because he hadn't read the papers that had been delivered. So he was quite clear on record that he hadn't actually read them, so he was voting against. So it was an interesting time. All right, so my question, and you may wish to answer it in public excluded, I'm not sure, but what has this judicial review done in terms of upsetting the investor announcement?
I think I'd prefer to talk about that in the confidential session. Thank you.
Before we go out of public excluded into public excluded, I'd just like to note obviously now the opportunity is there for Fish and Game to be more collaboratively engaged. They've stepped out of this process, and I think that's a good thing that we're focusing on Forest and Bird, but let's not focus on the fact that there's some progress now to be made with Fish and Game as well.
Can you elaborate a bit on that, Fish and Game? I mean, it's been a journey, but there's some daylight now.
Oh, I think the whole consents framework for the scheme sets up some actually formal obligations for the consent holder around ongoing liaison and advisory groups and so forth around both the biodiversity offsets program as well as its obligations elsewhere in the scheme. And so as soon as a switch is flicked, assuming we get to that point on proceeding with the past financial close, all of those mechanisms lock into place. In the meantime, there is and have been discussions, for example, I've raised this one I think previously, but for example around Lake Hautuma, and where the scheme could potentially add and enhance water quality in the lake and its surrounds. And I think there's a genuine interest, frankly, from both Fish and Game as well as Forest and Bird locals around that opportunity. And so I think the moral of these things is moving forward. I think it's in everybody's interest that we take the wins where we can, actually, and that's an obvious one. So, and it'll only work if those people are involved anyway.
Further questions? Just, I know you gave us quite a fulsome report also at the AGM, and hence there was nothing to add basically at the end of this month, and I appreciate you turning up. But can I just ask, we'll expect a bit more fulsome reporting next month, or the end of next month?
Yes, because we'll be back into the cycle.
Okay, great. No further questions. Someone happy to move, then we accept that report. As it stands, thank you, Councillor Scott. We have a second. Thank you, Councillor Pipe. Discussion. Put that motion in. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. I'm actually going to close the meeting because that was the last item, and invite everyone to take a minute or two to have a stretch. I need to go to a little room down the